everybody. I'm Raven Stubbs with Women and Children First Bookstore. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Women and Children First Bookstore is one of a few remaining feminist bookstores in the country that is fully owned and operated by women, which we are super excited about and very, very proud of. We want to welcome you all to this virtual event the same way in which we would if you were in our store for this event, which is by acknowledging the land that we sit on. So here in Chicago, while some land was purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare on the Pan-Indian movement to keep colonizers out of the Great Lakes, and then another purchase happened around 1835 when natives were pushed west, known in colonizers' history as the Trail of Tears, it's really important to understand that all land was violently taken. Our bookstore stands on occupied, unceded territory of Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami people. We encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgement and the rightful owner of the land where you are viewing tonight's events at native-land.ca, which I will drop down in our little chat box. Additionally, beyond land acknowledgement, you can find yourself supporting your local land back initiatives and grassroots native movements. If you're in the Chicagoland area, a great place to start is the American Indian Center Chicago. We will also share the link to that site. So thank you all. If you haven't already purchased tonight's book, Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness, you can do so by ordering online at womenandchildrenfirst.com. We can ship to any place in the continental U.S. You can also purchase the book by coming into our store. We're open Tuesdays to Sundays, 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. You also can do curbside pickup for those who aren't ready to mingle with the rest of us. That's totally still a part of our model. Our website will also provide a calendar of upcoming events. An event that's getting a lot of buzz already is our Wednesday, September 29th event with Anita Hill and Nikki Kendall, authors of the newly released Believing and bestseller Hood Feminism, respectively. So feel free to check that out. Now, as for our event tonight, we are uber excited to have author Deshaun Harrison and Hanif Abdurraqib. Thank you. I'll introduce them and then turn the floor over to them. At any point during the conversation, please feel free to ask any questions you have of our panelists by using the Ask a Question tab that's going to be at the bottom of your screen. This is going to be the place that's going to capture all of your questions, and we will get to them during the Q&A session. So, Belly of the Beast. The first point of this work, having a very clear historical analysis, was the acknowledgments being in the front of the book instead of the traditional placements in the back. Mm-hmm. It, for me, was that understanding that, like, before you call yourself being anew in contemporary existence, you need to acknowledge your history. Yeah. Before you call yourself being a part of this self-love movement, you need to understand where self-hate entered your life and when you learn that as fact. So thank you so much for that. I screamed only 12 pages in when you laid out desire capital and mapped folks through the capital P pretty privilege and access to beauty. I wish I possessed more of an eloquent way of saying how nuanced it is and how specific the truths on the pages are, but I'm going to be pedestrian and just say it that way. And thank you so much for being careful and showing care by way of precision. Every single thought nailed down the experience and the existence that belongs to me, given there is some lack of the intersectionalities in this book that I don't experience, and that I hear from my partner who is Black, who is fat, who is GNC and mass, other folks in my chosen family and my community. Yeah. You nailed it. Like, I don't know how else to say it other than you nailed it, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, no, thank you so much. I'm excited to kick this off. I'm so excited for people to be in conversation with you and Hanif. So I'm going to read you all's bios, and then it'll be all yours. So Deshaun Harrison is a Black trans writer, abolitionist, and community organizer in Atlanta, Georgia. Harrison currently serves as the managing editor of Where Your Voice magazine and is the author of Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness and as Anti-Blackness, which is why we're here tonight. Harrison is also a public speaker who often leads workshops on Blackness, queerness, gender, fatness, disabilities, and the intersection at which they all meet. Their portfolio and other work can be found on their website, DeshaunHarrison.com, which I will include in the link over to the side. Hanif Abdurraqib is a writer from the east side of Columbus, Ohio. Period. Okay. No other explanation. Okay. So let's get to the good stuff. Here you all have it. Deshaun Harrison, Hanif, and the Belly of the Beast. Thank you.
Thank you. Hanif, I'm so excited about this. Like, I'm looking forward to this. We are about to do a reading of some of the book. I'm going to read actually most of chapter 6, which is called Meeting Gender's End. And then once I finish with that, Hanif and I will get into the conversation. This chapter is my favorite chapter of the book. And I'll probably get a chance to talk more about why that is later on, but I'll start reading now. What has been explored throughout this book is the varying ways in which one's Blackness and fatness is always in conflict with the world. How, if one is fat and Black, they are always already illegible, animalistic, and undesirable. This is true too, and perhaps even more so when one is also trans. And yet, there is so little research on fat Black trans people. It's as though we breathe in the bodies of beings that never existed. And to some extent, we haven't and we don't. We have breath in our lungs, but existence, or who does and does not exist, is determined by people unlike us, for whom white supremacy, and more specifically anti-Blackness, and cis heterosexism remain at the helm. But that makes trans people no less tangible. We can be physically touched, seen, and heard, and still so much about how we navigate through and experience life is so under-researched, undervalued, and dismissed. Gender, just like health and desirability, is a system forged with the purpose of creating and maintaining a class of subjects designed to be inferior to another. The role of either gender is achieved through a continued performance. These roles and these performances are implied, but also explicitly named characteristics and duties one must fulfill to be man or woman. They are not inherent to us, meaning we are not born as boys or as girls. In basic sociological terms, we are taught immediately after birth through social institutions like family, media, and school what role we must fulfill if we are to hold on to the gender we are assigned at birth. When we start breaking the rules of those assigned roles and thus falling outside of gender's hold, we become sissies or tomboys, depending on which role you were assigned to fulfill from birth. As Judith Butler states in her book, Gender Trouble, our behaviors that are gendered are not innate to us. We learn them, and then we learn to perform them. And this performance is policed and maintained by cis heteronormativity, or the idea that everyone already is, and therefore all things must be seen as cisgender and heterosexual. In other words, cis heteronormativity is the law and order of gender in that it is what determines who is departing from their assigned role and must therefore be punished because of it. To this point, and to return to Butler, it is not our gender that defines our performance, but rather our performance that is always and already defining our gender. In her essay, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, Butler refers to gender as an illusion and an object of belief, expanding further by noting that gender reality is performative, which means, quite simply, that it is real only to the extent that it is performed. What performed means in this sense is not that one is standing on a stage or pretending to do something for the sake of being lauded, but rather that one is creating the thing by which their life and beinghood is defined through myriad acts and repetitions. So what is gender? It is only what we make it, but what we make it is defined by, in simple terms, the world around us. Hortense Spillers knew this too about the Black in particular when she wrote Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American Grammar book. In that essay, as we covered earlier in this book, Spillers provides an analysis for what it means for Black fat subjects to always be ungendered. Spillers provides an analysis for what it means for Black subjects to always be ungendered. This means that gender is lost to the Black, which more directly means that gender reads differently for our bodies and our being. Ungendered as monstrosity, it is to suggest that we are removed from gender, that we are misaligned with the normative coherent gender, making us beasts from birth. In summation, gender is a performance defined by our commitment to upholding it. And despite the fact that gender was never created for the Black to have access to, in similar ways to health and desirability, Black subjects are socialized to uphold the violence of gender too, and therefore can reproduce similarly violent gender restrictions. And since this is the case, gender must also be destroyed precisely because it can only ever reproduce cis-heterosexist violence. And within that cis-heterosexist violence, there will always also be anti-fat violence. I spoke with 7 fat Black trans people, all of whom are either trans men, trans masculine, or non-binary, for them to tell their own stories because it's their stories that provide the data we so often lack. I asked each of them the same questions and followed up with some of them for more questioning. And I'm going to skip the actual interviews and read a little bit of the end of the chapter. None of the people who provided testimonials for this chapter had spoken to any other participant before answering my questions. And yet each of them provided similar responses to each other. That is not coincidental. Fat Black trans people are forced to move to and through gender in a way that makes most evident to me that gender itself is something worth interrogating more closely. In so many ways, fatness functions as a gender of its own. Fatness fails and therefore disrupts the foundation on which gender is built. This is why the request is made of fat trans people to lose weight before they can be affirmed in their gender, or why little fat Black boys are misread as girls, or why fat Black women are oftentimes denied access to womanhood in a way that operates differently than the typical ungendering of Black subjects at large. But gender is birthed from violence. And therefore, fatness operating as its own gender is not liberatory so much as it is forced. Fat people are situated in this extension of what is already a prison because fat bodies deviate from, or rather are already positioned outside of, the designated or assigned look of gender. This is to say that the attempt to broaden the normate template only further harms undesirable people and reifies the very real violences of gender itself. At the beginning of this chapter, we define gender. What the 7 subjects walked us through after that is something we also agreed on at the start of the chapter. Gender is only what we make it. All 7 of them, in one way or another, talked about how much they had to almost force themselves into a space, how they had to forge their own paths, create their own gender within a gender, because their fatness had already denied them the ability to do something about it. Because their fatness had already denied them the ability to do anything but that. They each also presented this truth, even if unknowingly so. In so many ways, gender is defined by thinness, in that for one to fit comfortably into the performance, they must always be pushing away from fatness to not otherwise be engaged as the beast. If shedding oneself of fatness, or altogether removing themselves from fat as an identity, is the only way for one's gender to be affirmed, both socially and surgically. Perhaps gender is no longer a performance we can afford to keep in business. Fat trans people are finding it nearly impossible to find binders that feel affirming for them. Many are being forced to engage in an inherently anti-Black and anti-fat medical system that uses body mass index as an indicator for whether or not they deserve to be affirmed in their bodies. We are being engaged as the other, even in spaces that in name were created for our comfort and safety. Gender works in relationship to health and desire as a means to further ostracize the Black fat. And as this is the case, only one solution will prove to be sufficient enough for our liberation. We must see to gender's end, which means we must destroy gender.
Fam, thank you so much for that. And thank you for letting me be a part of this. I've said it a lot, but I love this book. And what I think I love most about the book is that it's generous. I think to be the holder of a very specific type of, I've been trying to get away from using the word like lived experience, but to be the holder of a very specific type of knowledge through what you've endured, happily or otherwise, is one thing, but to choose to share that knowledge and make it accessible to anyone who might be adjacent to, but maybe on the outside of some of that experience so that they might better love themselves, their people, and beyond is a real generosity. So this book is an immense generosity, and I thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
And I'm glad you read from that chapter, because that's actually the chapter, and I'm actually glad you skipped the interviews, in part because I had so many questions about the interviews. Okay. When I read the book, one of my first impulses was about how brilliantly it kind of worked against data as on its face, not only anti-Black, but missing. There are holes in the way that data is presented, obviously, and therefore it might be on our people to create a living archive of a reality that goes against data. And so the interview chapter was fascinating to me. I'd never seen anything like it in the book, and I'd never seen it. And I feel like I remembered when you put that call. I didn't know what it was for at the time, but I feel like I remembered on Twitter when you put that call out.
Yeah.
And so it was wild to see it manifest itself in the book in that way. It was so impressive. And I was wondering if you could talk about what drove you to the interview process, or trying to gather that text from other folks, and what it was like to kind of weave that into a book, which for me, that felt like a non-traditional form, a process that I really loved. I loved how it came out.
Thank you so much for that. And that was the goal. I wanted to be non-traditional in that way because of how I started the chapter off. So what led me to wanting to do those interviews was, I think, a couple of things. I was in the process of writing this book. I'm reading all of this gender theory, and I have my own conclusions. I'm drawing my own conclusions and my own thoughts, but so much about the data that you find is it's not specific enough. It's not asking, researchers aren't asking particular questions that I'm trying to get at. And when they do, it's very, it's fleeting. It's like, it's here and there, and it may or may not really get to the heart of what I'm trying to work through. So for me, I was like, people make data. Like our experiences is where data comes from. So the best way to get this is to talk to folks. And so that's when I put out the call on Twitter. I had already spoken to a lot of my friends, many of whom are transmasculine folks and non-binary folks. But I wanted to engage people who I didn't know, who I wasn't friends with, who I wasn't necessarily in community with, so that I could really draw the conclusions that I'd come to in my head by reading theory and also through my own experience. So when I did those interviews, there was conversation about making them using those interviews as ways to write the chapter in I guess a more formal way. But I didn't want to condense people's words. I didn't want to add an inference to their words. I wanted their words to be written as plainly as possible. And so the only option to me was to have the interviews in the chapter. And I knew from the beginning that that was like a really non-traditional thing to do, especially in a book that's theory. It's like, this is not something that you typically ever really find. But for me, that's why I wanted it to be that way, was because I wanted to make a few statements. One, like that the words and the feelings of Black trans folks matter enough for me to include them in my work by name, and not just as numbers or as statistics, but also so that it was clear that we don't always have to take theory as seriously as I think that we do. You know, it's very important work that I think that theorists are producing, but I don't think that it requires that we sort of forget the fact that we're engaging our community, that we're engaging actual beings. And so I thought it was just very important for me to really like make sure that I included their names, their words directly as they gave them to me, which is also why I didn't want to do like a phone interview or a Zoom interview. I wanted it to be written so that how you wrote it, so long as, you know, it was like, it made sense grammatically. Like, as long as that was the case, I didn't want to change anything because I wanted everything to be as raw as possible. Because again, like the chapter is really bringing us to I think a difficult conclusion for some people. It's asking for us to, or it's telling us that we have to destroy gender. And I wanted it to be very clear that I'm not misconstruing anyone's words. Like, all the words are here for you to read yourself. And when you get to that end of the chapter, that's how the conclusion is drawn.
Yeah, and also because I don't know if well, I can only speak for myself, and I found that chapter like challenging is not the word though, right? It's a delightful confrontation.
Yeah,
more.
I like that,
because for me, challenging suggests that, like, when folks are challenged, they're coming from a point of dismissal, and I felt confronted in a way that didn't necessarily challenge me. It just asked me to reach for the kind of like an infinity model, right? When thinking about what the world could be, which I think is propulsive. There was so much in this book that I found propulsive because I think it was reaching the highest levels of imagination. Like, literally, we talk about like, imagine a better world or imagine a world without X, Y, Z.
right.
But not always do we get to confront like someone saying, okay, but here is the world without X, Y, Z, and here's how you can get to it. There's also something I loved about that chapter in particular. And I'm wondering if you could touch on like the research process and the writing of the book, because there's things I've seen you write about and talk about at the intersection of fatness, Blackness, trans identity, these things where there's hypervisibility in some ways, and then a desire from the outside world, the kind of like cis heterosexual violence of like that world that is seeking a type of invisibility. And I'm wondering if the research process for this book, which feels like it had to have been rigorous, just based off of like my reading of it, were there any surprises or small confirmations? Like you said, you had to get these interviews from people to confirm that you were not just like living your life in your own head and nowhere else. And I think that's actually one of the joys of research for me, is reminding myself that the world is as America in particular is as irredeemable as I believe it to be.
Right.
But rarely do we talk about the pleasures of that. So I'm wondering if there were some pleasureful confirmations in the research process of the book too.
Oh, I love this. This is like, I think that you're a genius. But yeah, so that was one of them where I got to have those interviews with folks, and I was like, yeah, no, like, I'm not making this up. Like, this is actually a thing that so many of us experience. I think another one for me was when and yes, the research process for this book was very rigorous. It was very hard because a lot of the texts that I cited, I had read prior to, but I mean, you have written several books. Like there's, at least in my experience in this, there was like a very different relationship to reading and writing this text for a book versus reading it just like to obtain the knowledge, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So like I had to revisit a lot of what I'd already read, and I had to like revisit it as though it was my first time reading it, and trying to really like grasp the heart of what's being said, because I don't want to like misuse anyone's words or misuse anyone's thoughts, and so it was a rigorous process. But another like really enjoyable, I think, moment in the research process was for chapter 3, which is on health in the Black fat, and reading through and finding, actually I think chapter 3 and chapter 5 in so many ways they're connected. Chapter 5 is the connection between the war on obesity and the war on drugs.
Right.
Going through and like reading about all of the ways that government, politicians, and like government funded scientists like the CDC and the World Health Organization and all of these like entities like really have found ways to like to jeopardize all of our lives, to harm all of us in so many ways. But to actually read that, like hear the words of Reagan and Nixon on the phone with each other, and like see written emails and text messages between CDC researchers and whatnot, and the time when they published the 2004 journal entry, like all of that being right in front of me and actually having access to that was like, I was mesmerized. And I know that word is usually used as like a positive thing. And I don't mean that I was like happy that that the things happened, but that it was like, wow, all these things really did happen. And it's something that I've read about before and that I've talked about a lot. But I think, again, just like writing all of this at one time and having all of that, like having a million tabs open on my laptop, having like 3-4 books open at one time, like highlighting and writing things in, it was like a whole world was coming together. And I think that was like, I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I hadn't reflected on that before. But the writing process, I have been describing it as more gruesome than not. But I actually, like, after reflecting in that way, it actually was really affirming in so many ways, because again, like the world was coming together all at once at one time with all of this research happening together. So I enjoyed it. It was like a hard book to write and a lot of hard research, but it was also like an enjoyable process, even in the middle of 2020.
I'm glad you brought up the chapter on the drug war, because I wanted to touch on surveillance in the ways that your writing has made me think about surveillance in the police state, and how, when Black folks, I mean, myself included, like talk about and fall into this one hand reality of saying, well, the police state is anti-Black, and leaving it at that, we're maybe doing a disservice to, of course, the many intersections
right
inside of which the police state is anti-Black. And one of them is the idea of surveillance, which you have so thoughtfully talked about in terms of fatness and Blackness, like anti-fatness and anti-Blackness intersecting to create a kind of heightened surveillance state that even exists outside of the specter of quote unquote traditional policing, as we know policing.
Right.
But there's another layer to that is also violent, but exists outside of, yet feeds the same violence that presents itself in the quote unquote traditional police state. And so that was really a fulfilling thing for me to think about. Like I've seen you write about and talk about Mike Brown before, and like these kind of the ways that anti-Blackness and anti-fatness show up more often than not at these intersections that deserve their own kind of space to be teased out instead of kind of being put solely under this umbrella of like, well, we're all impacted by this. So specifically, if you talk about surveillance and how surveillance impacts both the kind of inner workings of policing and these societal policings that are presented, that we're up against the glass of.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So of course, in chapter 4, like that entire chapter is about policing and the blatant or I guess making the connection between anti-Blackness and anti-fatness more blatant with regards to policing. And I think that, like you said, oftentimes, I've organized for years and all these spaces that we've been in, it's always, policing is anti-Black, policing is anti-Black, or this is anti-Black racism, or this is racist, or the system is racist, whatever, right? Like that was always the general consensus, which is true. It's not wrong. But I wanted to write that chapter 4 and chapter 5, because I wanted it to be clear that, like you said, there are a lot of marginal experiences within a marginal experience that oftentimes is excluded from the conversation. And when it comes to fatness in particular, so often in our organizing spaces, a lot of folks aren't even considering fatness as a marginalized identity. And that for me was like, I have to write this chapter so that we know that this is not something that we can just push off or just something that we can ignore. But in fact, we are being hyper surveilled. We are being hyper criminalized. We are being engaged at disproportionate rates and murdered in disproportionate rates to our thin counterparts. And that isn't to say, that policing is anti-Black only for, Black fat folks, but it is to say that even our thin counterparts are oftentimes in closer proximity to being read as fat or larger than not, which is why I included the stories of Tamir Rice and George Floyd, because they weren't fat necessarily, but they were larger in size, and that played a significant role in how they were engaged. And it's not an analysis that we don't hear often, in our communities. I think I don't know a Black person who was raised in the hood who doesn't have some sort of story about, if not them, one of their family members not wanting to be engaged a particular way because of their size, right, by police, or being afraid of being engaged a particular way by police because of their size. But it hasn't gone far enough to be understood as a structural analysis. But police for as long as for as far back as chattel slavery have been engaging our bodies in a very particular way, to where there has always been a need in their minds for a hyper surveillance, right? I talk a lot about Sabrina String's work in this book, and she tells us, that in the 19th century, during the transatlantic slave trade, when anti-fatness becomes a coherent ideology, it's through the way that fatness is read on Black bodies. That is the start of policing, right? If we understand policing to be what it is, I know that a lot of us, and even in the book, we cite like slave patrols as the origin of policing. But for me, even further back than that, the origin of policing is when they decided to take our bodies from our homeland and brought us over here. That is policing. That's hyper surveillance. And that then cannot be separated from our bodies and our body size. That because of that surveillance, we get the BMI to determine our collective health, our individual health, which then means that Black folks are being positioned as the only people who are experiencing all of these different, medical issues or who are at the heart of these medical issues, but we don't get access to healthcare. We don't get access to proper medical care, and neither does the medical system care enough about trying to figure out why it would be that Black folks are the only ones who are being affected by these medical issues, right? And maybe how untrue that might be. And so for me, like the surveillance state, the police state that we are living in, this militarized police state that we are experiencing, that we think is more modern than it is, to me, it starts with the transatlantic slave trade. And so that's why I'm like, you can't separate that from fatness. You can't remove that from our body size, because that has always been how we've been engaged, which is why, even the smallest of us can be made into, fat caricatures, right? Like the most popular one being Sarah Bartman. She was not an actual like fat woman. She was actually very petite. She just had a larger behind, but she became this caricature that turned her into a fat Black woman. Yeah. And that's not by happenstance. That's not something that happens, every now and again. That happens to Black folks all the time, because that's how our bodies are read. So, I think that like the way that we think about surveillance, the way that we think about policing, the way that we think about militarization, all has to exist in the context of Black fatness, because all of us as Black folks are in some ways in proximity to fatness, even if we don't experience a day-to-day life as a fat person, if that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense. I'm also Fam, you're just so smart, like real talk. And I'm also like reaching the point in a conversation where I got a bunch of questions that I realize I'm not going to get to. So I'm going to get to the one that I'm like most.
Yeah, I got to stop talking so much.
No, because I mean, it's a necessity, right? And it's just how it goes. You write down a bunch of questions and then it's like, well, this man gonna get to them all. But the one that was like at the forefront of my mind that I kind of wanted to lead with, but I'm going to get to now, I want to talk about Southernness in specifics, right? Like Black Southernness, obviously, and how size in a relationship to size is regional sometimes and generational sometimes, and all of these things. I mean, I have kinfolk from the South. Obviously, I'm like like dyed in the wool Midwesterner or whatever, but I have kinfolk from the South. Like most Black folks I know in America have kinfolk who are Southern.
Yeah.
And there's something, I don't even know what the main question I want to get at here, but I think there was something I was thinking about with your book, and like hearing some of your interviews talk about how fatness and Blackness kind of projects itself. It's not even everywhere. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? It's not, and there's something about Southernness that I think I have seen fatness and Blackness particularly intersect with these either sources of pride or shame.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you see that, if you see any regional or generational differences in how, I mean, you live in the South now. I mean, you have a relationship with the South that I don't have. And so that's why that question was at the forefront of my mind, because it was one of those things where it's like, I feel like there's something interesting to be said here, but I don't have the language to say it.
Yes, no, yeah, I think you do have the language. You just said it. Like that was a big part of some of chapter 2. I was referencing Kiese's book, Heavy. I love him, and I love that book. And a lot of his writing is really moving through what it's like to be fat and Black in the Black South. And I wanted to talk about that too, because I do think that the Black South has a very particular, or rather fatness has a very particular sort of legibility in the Black South. that sort of makes it a little bit more difficult to formulate an analysis on I guess anti-fatness because of how, what's the word I want to use? I guess how popular fatness is here, right? Like you don't walk down the street and not see somebody fat, right? And if you are a Black person, you're guaranteed to have fat folks in your family. So it's not like that, like we're an anomaly here, as it's often projected to be outside of the South. But I sort of, to me, that is like, I think that it is an example. If I wanted to use an analogy, I would use the sort of really huge issue that we saw with the last presidential election, not this most recent one, but with Hillary and Trump, and folks were like, well, Hillary is the better option, Trump is the worst option, that type of thing. But I think that it's easy to think of Hillary Clinton as a progressive, a person who has a progressive politic. She doesn't spew her rhetoric as openly as Trump does, right? Like, it's a very easy thing to be like, oh, well, I'd rather have Hillary than I would Trump. But then you get into the actual back end of their policies and how they operate and how long they've been in politics, right? And actually you see that in so many ways she is maybe perhaps more harmful than Trump was, right? But that's not what it looks like on the front end. And so I think that, and what that really means is that it's harmful no matter where you exist. All of it is harmful. But I think that the Black South has a very particular relationship to fatness that makes it harder to offer this analysis, because everyone's fat, but everyone's also trying to diet. Everyone's fat, but everyone's also antagonizing their family members for being fat, right? Everyone's fat, but everyone's also complaining every Thanksgiving dinner, every Christmas dinner about how we can't keep eating like this, right? Like that's the relationship that we have to food and to fatness in the South, while everyone remains fat, right? And so in the book, I wanted to really sort of walk us through this dichotomy, this binary that we present each other with by the ways that fatness is talked about in the South versus the North, the West, and the Midwest. And to me, by the way, the Midwest is just a colder part of the South, if you ask me. Yeah. But so I think that there is like a disconnect happening in the ways that we move through all of this language and the ways that we move through fatness as an identity. But the Black South, I think, gets the rep that it does because of its proximity to the slave. And so I think that so much about our relationship to fatness, even if unnamed, is that we recognize that the slave too has always been engaged as a Black fat, right? And not as someone who is not fat, which is why we talk about specific foods that are sort of central to Black Southern cuisine as slave food, right? Any way you see it, you'll see somebody calling chitlin slave food, or you'll see somebody calling pig's feet slave food, or whatever, right? And we recognize that this Black Southern cuisine, that this relationship to fatness that seems to be very specific to the Black South is something that is connected to, that's in proximity to, that is in the genealogy of the slave. And so I think that becomes sort of like a central issue that sort of determines how fatness is talked about regionally, right? So you'll hear folks talk about the West Coast as as though everyone there is thin. But I know a lot of folks in the West who have families that look just like they came from the Black South, because so many of them did come from the Black South, right? Which means that none of us can separate ourselves from the slave, but we want to. We want to remove ourselves from the proximity or from being in proximity to the slave. And so by doing so, we antagonize fatness. By doing so, we antagonize Black cuisine. By doing so, we antagonize things. We antagonize the Black South. We say that the Black South is nowhere to be, that it's more racist than anywhere else, that it's this harmful place. And it's like, folks will call you the N-word no matter where you are.
Yeah.
Like, I know some real, redneck places in New York. Like it's something that you can experience everywhere. But the hope, the I think, the hope that a lot of people have, that a lot of Black folks have, is to be able to remove themselves from being in relations to the slave, which is why I think we call for less slave films. I don't agree with that. I think that, our stories can never be told enough, because there's so much about our stories we don't know. They just can't be told correctly through Hollywood because of capitalism. That's how that works. But I think that is sort of why things look the way that they do in the Black South, but also you can, like I said, you can live in the Black South and still be antagonistic towards other fat folks because of the ways that we're socialized, or the ways that we're socialized to believe fatness to be bad, fatness to be harmful. And I think that is, that too is connected to the slave. I think that there's no way for us to disconnect that, but we want to desperately. And I think that is how we arrive at a regional difference in how we relate to fatness.
Before I get into these last two quick questions, I would say anyone who has questions, I meant to say this earlier, you could drop them in the Q&A box, and I'll hit them on the way out. That's the last thing we'll get to. But so if you have those, start dropping them in there now, and I'll go through them and all that. But so the last two things I want to talk about, one was the cover, because I love the cover of the book, and it's beautiful. I think it's most beautiful in its repetition, right? And there was something about not only having the self on the book cover, but having yourself on the book cover in the same way, mostly the same way multiple times, was this kind of really brilliant interruption, and really beautiful interruption of expectation. And so my main question on the book cover is, did you take that shot yourself? Because I know that you are very skilled at the selfie in the way, what I mean? So I was like, who did you have a photographer come through? Because the lighting is great. Who did that?
No, I took it myself. It was on an iPhone 7S Plus at the time. It was February 2019. I was in Toronto for the very first time. It was my first time outside of the States too. And I was like, every hotel I go to, I have to do this. So I took it myself. Yeah. And I did not expect that it would ever become a book cover, but here we are.
What was that process like? Did you just tell them yo, this is what I want for the cover, here's a shot?
No. So actually it was a really very strenuous process. Every proposed cover was a cover that I didn't like. I was like, this doesn't sell the book that I'm trying to sell. This doesn't give the reader the context that I want to provide them with. And funny enough, I don't know. This might not be your experience. I won't say I don't know anyone yet, but for all the Black authors that I know that I've asked, they've all had a similar experience with their publishing house, with, trying to find the correct book cover, which, it can be hard because I think that we're telling stories that haven't been told before. But we went through, I think 4 different covers, and I was like, okay, I don't like any of this. And then it was also hard to find stock images of fat Black masked folks, because there was very few that were fat and Black, and then the ones that were of like people who identified as women or whose bodies were feminized in a particular way. And I knew that the book was very much geared towards fat Black masked folks and folks who are masculinized. And so I wanted it to be something else. And I didn't want my face to be necessarily clear for folks who don't know who I am and don't know this image, so that what they saw was an image of a fat Black person on the cover, and not necessarily, Deshaun Harrison, right? Like I wanted somebody to look at this and be like, this is a fat Black person on this cover, and I'm kind of like feeling compelled to pick this up just so I can see what this is about. Maybe my experiences in this book. And so that's where it came from. The idea came from. They were like, okay, well, do you have any like tasteful news that we can use to make this cover, because we can't find any stock images? And I was like, I have a folder. I'll send you. And my coworker and friend Sharonda, actually, she's who created the image. She was like, I can do this. Like she did like a quick workup in Canva and created it. And then the designer for the publishing house created it in a different app. But that's like where the design came from. That's how the image was picked. And when I saw it, I was like, okay, this is a book that I can be in love with. This is a book that I feel that I can be proud of, not just for the words, but because the cover to me was just very powerful and also very new. Like this image is shared online everywhere, but I never thought that my body would be on the cover of a book where it's around the world. And now I got random people looking at my body on a book. So it was like a very new like thing for me, but I'm really, really happy that we went with that, because I think that it's just powerful in a very particular way.
Yeah, I agree. It's beautiful. And I'm really thankful for the, I think the aesthetics of books and book covers are important. They're both important, and I try not to spend too much time thinking about them, but I really loved how yours centered the body, and it made, I don't know, after I read the book and I looked back at the cover, I was like, this is a pairing, like this is a perfect pairing. My last thing is that, outside of the book, what I actually really love your pop culture insights a lot. And I think this thing happens where writers who are at the margins or or determined to be or read as at the margins of an already marginalized experience, get pigeonholed, right? And so like it's easy, well, not easy, obviously, but like Black writers say, well, I get only asked to write about these type of things. But then we get like Black trans writers or Black queer writers or Black writers who, like you, who do immense and brilliant study on the history of anti-Blackness and anti-fatness. And all of these, like that even more shines a spotlight on people perhaps thinking that your interests and investments only lie in one place. Yep. But I actually have been really into, for a long time, actually, your pop culture insights, because, and I think we're maybe reaching a point, or I'm reaching a point where I know kind of what I want to read, like, and you mentioned this when Montero came out, you were kind of like, there's a lot of music critics who kind of try to like approach this who just don't have it in them, Right. And I think that's real, right? And for a few years now, I've kind of at the point where it's like, there's some shit I'm just not trying to read certain people on. It's not even a knock on those people. It's an understanding of like what I want. You know what I mean? Like there are people who have perspectives that are going to interest me more than other folks on some things, and that's just the way it rocks. And I was hoping you had some insights on what you hope for the future of pop culture journalism and the range that not only you have, but that we have as a people, and in the midst of all of our margins and whatnot, for what we can take on.
Yes. I love this because, yes, I love pop culture. I love like critiquing pop culture and studying like the history of pop culture and all of that. Like, I think that it's just really, 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 really dope. And I'm excited for more folks who maybe never really would have considered themselves to be writers to have opportunities to write pop cultural critique. I think that, and that's the work that we're trying to do at Warrior Voice, is really hone in on writers who maybe don't call themselves writers, or maybe don't know themselves to be writers, but they know that they have thoughts. They know that they have feelings. They know that they that something that they're feeling about, an artist or an album or a single or whatever is important to them. And I'm excited about that. I love seeing Black queer folks and Black fat folks and Black trans folks and all other Black folks who sit at different intersections, like being able to write, because I think just as a part of us having different identities, we bring a particular perspective that's not considered by a cishet music critic. And also, a lot of music critics are, and their publications are run by white men. So it's like, I do not want to hear or read writings from white men on a Black gay man's work of art. Like, I do not care. So, and especially with what Lil Nas X offered, I know this is not about Lil Nas X, but I'm going to say a little bit, he offered something that I think is one of the most brilliant debut albums we've gotten in a long time, right? Like, for this Black gay boy who became a man in front of our eyes, really, who's releasing chart-topping music right now. Like, for him to release an album that is really melodramatic in so many ways, it's very sad, it's very emo. Like, for him to do that at a time where what's at the height of music right now is trap, R&B and trap and hip hop, right? Like, for him to go back to a garage band sort of roots, which is what so many Black queer folks have experience with, and what so many of us were how we got through our own issues as children. For him to use that as his roots, I think was really powerful. I'm not going to talk about Lil Nas X all day, I promise. But all that to say that I think that there's something really, really, really important about where I think pop culture critique is going, and who is given access to be able to offer that critique. And I'm excited about that. I think that there are so many brilliant thinkers who have, because of Twitter, really, I think Twitter and TikTok, and really those two, Twitter and TikTok, have really allowed a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't be heard to get their voices out there. And I love that. I'm very excited about where that's going to go, where it's going to take us.
So we got one question from the audience. I think it's probably, looking at time, it's probably the only question we have time for, but okay. I'll ask you this question that came in. Hey, thank you so much for this talk. I hear you use the term and figure of the slave a lot. I wanted to know if you could share what that term / figure offers for you that the term / figure / position of the proletariat doesn't, particularly as it pertains to theorizing anti-Black fat phobia in a structural way.
I know exactly who asked this question. So I think that the proletariat, to me, is very specific to the worker, right? And I think that what we witnessed talking about chattel slavery is workers, right, who were masters of slaves, right? Like that was the experience of chattel slavery, right? I'm reading a book right now, actually, called "They Were Her Property," and I think that this is it's a great book. It's heart-wrenching, but it's a book about white women as slave owners, and so we see this sort of like the ways that I want to make sure I phrase this in a good way, because I know that the question is provocative, and I'm trying to make sure that I don't give a provocative answer. But what we witness with chattel slavery is that there is no solidarity between the worker and the slave. And in fact, there is no way for the slave or for the worker to find solidarity with the slave for as long as they are not also the slave, right? For as long as they are not also someone who's in power. Because if there is solidarity to be had, then that means that they don't hold power over those folks, right? Right? Like that means that you as someone who is quite literally, and a lot of, I think in modern history, a lot of theorists would call slaves workers, but workers are paid to some degree. Slaves are not. And they're not even guaranteed housing. A lot of slaves slept outside, right? Like this is not a volunteer, like a moment where you get to volunteer to work on the fields, right? Like you were forced into working on the fields. You were forced into eating when they forced you to, or not eating at all, right? You were forced into doing particular works for the master, and in the particular case of the mammy, which is where I think it's most important to sort of talk about or theorizing around anti-Black, anti-fatness. The mammy was forced into offering an image of a sort of a South that is in solidarity with the slave, while also being stripped from her ability to exist as a full being, as a whole being, as human. Right. This figure was positioned as, or turned into, a sort of symbol for what the South was in the midst of slavery, even though what she was still a slave, who was then desexualized, who was forced into nurturing and caring for white children, because the child as I think a structure has a very specific level of I think power. Shout out to my best friend Tatella, who I believe asked this question. The child as a structure has a very particular level of power symbolically, that pretty much said that if the slave is able to take care of our most prized possession, right, our children, the people, the thing that will one day grow up to be the next worker, that will one day grow up to be able to take over the factory, so to say, then there must be good happening here. There must be some good standing, a good relation between, the slave and the master. And so to me, I think that that's why I use the slave and not the proletariat, because I think that the Black, the other, the slave is always removed from the ability to exist only as the worker, right? To exist with a particular level of power that positions you as a worker and not also as the slave. And I think that we're witnessing that right now with, what's happening with migrants and Haiti. And, like in this moment, folks who are not Haitians, right, are being engaged in a very particular way, right? And I said folks, but really I could go to an example that one of my dear friends brought up earlier on Twitter. The horses are being cared for in a very particular way that Haitians are not, right? Even though America is land of the free, home of the brave, and all that, right? Like this is a welcoming space, but there are particular beings who are not allowed access to this form of liberation, and I'm using that language very intentionally. And so I think that when I start to talk about, or when I start theorizing around anti-Black, anti-fatness, and the slave in particular, my entry point is always really the mammy, because she is in so many ways, she's, I think, in connection to what Joy James would call the captive maternal. And so, yeah, I think that her symbolism is to stabilize the state, to offer some sort of way to justify the state's existence. But that's not as a worker. That is literally as a slave. There is no choice in that. That decision was made for her.
Wonderful answer. Thank you, Fan. And thank y'all. Thank y'all, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you, Women and Children First, for having us. And Fan, thank you so much for having me be a part of this. I love the book, and I love chopping it up with you about the book.
Thank you so much. So much.
And thank you all so much out there. Hanif, and I don't know if Hanif has left us, but Hanif and Deshaun, thank you all so much for sharing some of your time with us tonight. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Because we are still streaming, it is not too late to hit the buy the book button if you still have yet to purchase it. Once the streaming ends, you can still purchase the book from womenandchildrenfirst.com. It is never too late to purchase it. It's such a great piece of work to have in your collection, to be able to pull from, to be able to refer. And I promise you, these conversations are going to continue because, Deshaun, you are starting it, okay? There's so many amazing conversations that I cannot wait to see how people take them and fly out from them. So thank you so much for coming tonight. And everybody else, please stay safe as we are surviving in this jiggy jungle. And have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night, y'all.